It's a clash of titans, Bobby Fischer versus the magician from Riga, Mihail Tal, in the candidates tournament. We're diving into a razor-sharp Sicilian Najdorf, so buckle up for a tactical masterclass. The game opens with the classic Sicilian Najdorf. White grabs the center, black challenges it, and after the pawn trade on d4, the main lines are on the board. Fischer opts for the aggressive bishop to c4 setup, aiming directly at black's kingside. Tal responds in typical fashion, immediately launching a pawn storm on the queen side with b5 and b4. And now Fischer ignites the center. He pushes his f-pawn forward and then boldly sacrifices a knight on f5. The position is electric, an absolute tactical minefield for both players. Tal plays his rook to g8, but this is an inaccuracy. He missed a much stronger path. Simply taking the knight on f5 would have kept the balance. Now, Fischer has a powerful reply. Bishop to d5, which would have put black under serious pressure. Fischer finds the best move, slamming his bishop down on d5. After Tal moves his rook to a7, a flurry of captures follows, keeping the tension at a maximum. Fischer recaptures with his bishop to f5, but this lets the advantage slip. He should have kept the pressure on by moving his other bishop back to d5. This allows Tal's rook to swing over to e7, becoming a major player in the game. Just as predicted, black's rook lifts to e7. Fischer decides to trade, taking the bishop on c8, and Tal's queen recaptures on c8. This is an excellent move, and in fact, it's the only one that keeps black in the game. Any other recapture would have been serious trouble. Fischer plays his bishop to f4, another slip. The best move was to play the pawn to c3, shoring up the queen side. Now Tal has a clear target, and he can play queen to c6 to attack the vulnerable knight on a4. And there it is. Tal's queen slides to c6, immediately applying pressure and eyeing that loose knight. But look at this. Fischer unleashes the brilliant queen to f3. He offers a queen trade, but the real idea is to sacrifice his knight on a4. If black takes it, white's dark-squared bishop will come to life with devastating effect. What a concept! Tal is not one to back down from a challenge. He accepts the sacrifice, and the queen takes the knight on a4. And this is the follow-up. Fischer's bishop takes the pawn on d6, the only move that makes the entire sacrifice work. This is high-level chess, keeping the position perfectly balanced. Incredible. Tal responds with his own brilliant sacrifice, playing his queen to c6. He offers the queen right back. Tal understands that trading queens here completely neutralizes Fischer's attack. A fantastic defensive idea. Fischer takes the knight on b8, and Tal follows through with the plan, delivering a check on b6. And now, another brilliant move from Fischer. The king steps to h1. This isn't just a simple king move, it's a deep, attacking idea. He's preparing to sacrifice his bishop on b8 to unleash his rook on e1 with crushing force. Simply amazing. Tal steps into the fire, and his queen takes the bishop on b8. The critical moment has arrived. But Fischer makes a mistake. He gives a check with his queen to c6. This lets the attack fizzle out. The correct path was the stunning rook to e1, which would have kept the game on a knife's edge, leading to a complex but equal endgame. And Tal finds the perfect defense. The rook drops back to d7. This is the only move that works, but it's enough to completely shut down white's threats and seize a clear advantage. Fischer brings his other rook into the game with a check from e1, looking for any last chance. But Tal is a rock. He plays his bishop to e7, and it's the only defense that holds the winning position. A perfectly precise block. Fischer is in trouble and lashes out with a desperate sacrifice, but it's a mistake that will only make things worse. The best try was to keep the tension with queen to f6. The queen moves to f6. Black's king sidesteps to d8. The queen snaps up the pawn on f7, the rook slides to e8, and the queen takes another pawn on h7. But in the game, Fischer sacrifices his rook, taking the pawn on f7. This gives up a full rook for basically no compensation, and now black is completely winning. Tal calmly accepts the gift, and his king takes the rook on f7. This is the only move, and it's the correct one. He correctly calculates that Fischer's attack is completely over. Fischer throws in a final check with his queen to e6, but it's just a last gasp. Absolutely brilliant from Tal. The king slides to f8. He simply offers his rook on d7 for free. He knows that trading it will liquidate the position into a queen endgame where he is completely and utterly winning. What a cool-headed decision. Fischer takes the rook, and we enter the queen endgame. Tal's queen lands on d6, and he begins to press his advantage, methodically improving his position, while Fischer's king is forced to hide on g7. The maneuvering continues. Tal's bishop drops back to d8, and after a trade of pawns on the b-file, the endgame enters its next phase. Fischer pushes his pawn to g3, creating a little bit of breathing room for his own king. Tal delivers a check with his queen to c6, but this is a small slip. It allows Fischer to force a queen trade. The stronger move was rook to g5, keeping the queens on the board to continue torturing white, and Fischer jumps at the chance. He blocks with his rook on e4, forcing the queens off the board as black recaptures. Fischer's rook takes the queen on c4. It's the only move that keeps him in the game, though Tal still has a very large advantage in this rook and bishop endgame. The endgame begins. Tal's rook attacks on b6, and both kings rush towards the center to join the fight. After a check from the bishop on g5, white's king is forced back to e2. The king march continues. Tal's king advances to d5, and his bishop repositions to the excellent f6 square, tightening the screws. Fischer plays his rook to c2, a passive move that allows black to improve even more. He really needed to create counterplay with pawn to b3. Now Tal's bishop is free to take up a dominant post on d4, and Tal's bishop claims another great square, landing on e5. White is getting squeezed. Another inaccuracy from Fischer with the rook to e2. Once again, the pawn push to b3 was the best defensive try. This move allows black's rook to become incredibly active on the f-file. And here comes the rook. It swings to f6 and then crashes in with a check on f3. Fischer's king is forced to retreat, and Tal's bishop takes up a commanding post on d4. Fischer pushes his pawn to a3, but this move misses the point entirely and doesn't address black's main threats. The only real chance was a desperate counterattack with rook to c8. The rook swings to c8. Black's rook gives a check on f3. The king moves to e2. Another check comes on f2, and the king steps to d3. But in the game, Fischer plays his pawn to a3. This fatalistically allows Tal to create a winning passed pawn with his next move. Tal pushes his pawn to b3. It's actually a small inaccuracy in this incredibly complex position, but for all practical purposes, this passed pawn is going to be decisive. Now Fischer plays his rook to c8, but it's far too late. The position is completely lost, and this move doesn't change the evaluation one bit. The position devolves into chaos. Tal's bishop snaps up the pawn on b2, Fischer's rook gives a check on d8, and after a series of checks, white's king is driven all the way to c4, and Tal finds the killer blow, rook to c3 with check. This is the only move, a fantastic shot that keeps the win firmly in his grasp by forcing the white king into an even worse position. There's nothing else to do. Fischer's king is forced to the edge of the board, landing on b4. What is happening? Tal is completely winning, but here, he makes an unbelievable blunder that should lose the game on the spot. The simple and winning move was king to c7. The king calmly steps to c7. White's rook moves to h8, the bishop retreats to a1, the rook takes the pawn on h7 with check, and the king moves to d6. But instead, in a moment of madness, Tal plays his bishop to a1. This throws away the entire win. Now Fischer has a forced win with rook to c8 check, and the game should be over. Unbelievable! The final shocking twist in this legendary game. Fischer has a win on a platter, but in the heat of the moment, he misses it. The winning move was rook to c8 with check. The rook checks on c8. The king is forced to d5. The rook takes the rook on c3. The bishop recaptures with check, and the king simply takes the bishop, and white is winning. But in this moment of high drama, Fischer pushes his pawn to a4. It's a return blunder of epic proportions. He gives the win right back to Tal, and now that b-pawn is unstoppable. And that's it. Tal pushes his pawn to b2. It might not be the engine's top choice, but it doesn't matter. The pawn will become a queen, and there is nothing white can do to stop it, and what a finish. A game full of brilliance, sacrifices, and unbelievable blunders from both sides in the final moments. After a chaotic endgame, it is Mihail Tal who emerges victorious. Tal wins.